Coming up, we're exploring vendor risk management. We'll be touching on what vendor due diligence is and what we need to do for monitoring it during COVID-19. Best practices for security and supply chain, and 3 key action items at the end that you can take away from this podcast. I am Amy Vetter, coming to you from Cincinnati, Ohio, and these are just some of the topics we will be exploring in this October Cybersecurity Advisory podcast. Welcome to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, the unified voice of the AICPA and CIMA. Every week, you'll get insights that help you stay ahead of the curve, whatever your business and wherever you're based. I'm hosting this week, and my name is Amy Vetter. I am the CEO of the B3 Method Institute and based in Cincinnati, Ohio. Our topic this week is vendor management. And joining me to explore it is Audrey Katcher, partner from Ruben and Torpey from WipFli. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Amy.
I'm excited to have you both. And before we get into this discussion, I'd like to ask each of you to tell us something about yourself, where you're based, something about the kind of work you do, and why today's topic is important to you.
This is Audrey Katcher. I'm a partner at Ruben here in St. Louis, Missouri. I've been passionate about the supply chain and our vendor management programs for years, even way back when, before the internet. But currently, I think it's a very dynamic area in today's environment. So talking about vendor risk management today is going to be critical.
And following up, Audrey, this is Torpey. I'm a partner at WipFli. I lead the SOC practice for the firm and also perform some IT audit work as well. Vendors are such a critical part of all of our customers and clients' organizations and corporate America that we can't ignore the risks and advantages they present to most organizations. So it's a very critical topic to talk about because it is something that's interwoven into almost every organization.
Happy to have you both on today. And I think what's important is we start with some base definitions so that anyone listening, whether doing this kind of work or not, we've got a baseline for what we're talking about. So Audrey, would you want to start off and just define what a vendor is and just clarify it for this discussion today?
Yeah, thank you. For the discussion today, we're looking at vendors in a broad sense. They're going to be the individual or the business that your entity relies on. Even if you're not in supply chain manufacturing goods or distributing them, a third party that you rely on is still part of this vendor discussion today. For example, the OCC bulletin defines a vendor, or defines third parties, I should say. A third party relationship is any business arrangement between a bank and another entity by contract or otherwise. So today we'll be considering those in the supply chain, those in all kinds of industries that we as an entity have a reliance upon.
Great. And Torpey, with that in mind, how do you define vendor risk management?
So vendor risk management is very similar to the broader term of enterprise risk management in that an organization needs to think about the vendors that are in their business process and information technology processes. What advantages do those vendors present to the organization, but what risks do they also present to the organization? And is there an over-reliance on some vendors than others? And does that elevate the risk profile of that vendor for your particular organization? So it is a broad look at where do your vendors factor into the overall risk assessment that the organization is doing.
Now, if we are just going to go a little bit deeper into vendor risk management, there's really 2 key areas of new vendors and existing vendors. So Audrey, can you maybe go a little bit deeper into what you need to look for with new vendors?
Yeah, and with the new vendors, we've had a pretty good process across the entities and the firms on how we evaluate the security, availability, of not only the product but the systems before we engage with them, and we write the necessary terms into the contracts. With that, though, I do want to add, and Torpey can add on to that, what we haven't been so good at is with the existing vendors, taking that 5-step process on understanding who's important, why they're important, the risk, and ranking them based on that risk, monitoring those vendors, and then implementing an escalation plan if that vendor has an issue at any time during the year. So there are 2 areas to consider: the new vendors as well as the existing.
Thanks, Audrey. I would say that with new vendors, many organizations spend a lot of time going through the due diligence process and define the terms and conditions, but then almost forget about those terms and conditions and making sure vendors are adhering to them after going through the procurement process. So to your point about those new vendors then becoming existing vendors, where do they fit into the landscape of an organization's supply chain, business process, information technology process? And how do you make sure that those vendors are adhering to the terms of the agreement or the contract that you signed with them at the beginning of the business relationship?
So who is typically responsible for that in an organization, and how often should they be looking for that?
So it varies from organization to organization. It could be your chief compliance officer. It could be a chief risk officer if the organization has that position defined. It could be in legal, or it could be in finance. It depends on how the organization has defined themselves and set up their delegation of authority as to where that responsibility lies. But it is going to be an administrative function, and it really should be the responsibility of someone that has the wherewithal to get to department heads, to get to senior management, and find out what vendors are doing for the organization, where they fit in the landscape, what their ultimate business objective is, and pulling that all together into one complete cohesive package that can be evaluated. To Audrey's point about how do we rank those vendors, how do we assign a risk value to those vendors, and then what are we doing to monitor those vendors. I have an example of a client that had a critical vendor that went out of business, and they only gave the client 2 weeks notice. The notice went to the director of IT, who was out on health leave. He didn't get the notice until he came back, and the critical vendor was out of business, and they were unable to obtain any of their data because it was gone and the facility was sold to another organization. No one was monitoring that vendor closely enough to know what was going on. And with a little sleuthing, they could have found out that that vendor lost their second round of joint venture financing, gave their customers 2 weeks notice, and shut their doors. So it can be something that is real. It happens to business and should be part of the risk landscape for the whole organization.
You talk about this due diligence and monitoring, but now because of the pandemic and other considerations, Audrey, what is of highest priority now, or that you need to do more of or less of?
First and foremost, as we always say, never waste a good crisis. Some entities that we've interacted with over the last 7 months have had interference due to the pandemic. They had unexpected situations where people were working out of the office, didn't have the technology, but they didn't have the vendor access in place either. So with the increased risk of outages with the people or services due to the pandemic, how is that going to affect the business? So you might get your own people up and running, but do you have a vendor who's not going to be available. With the environment, with the altered physical and logical environments, security and availability outages need to be considered. And it may not just be for your workforce that may be working from home, but the workforce you're dependent on to provide you your services or your supplies. Two more areas. The workforce that is working, they could be reduced. They could be out for 2 weeks due to the pandemic on a rotating basis. So how is the support of your vendor going to manage through that to make sure there's no interruption, for example, for your online orders or whatever that service is? And lastly, the vulnerability. I think in today's world, the vulnerability to our vendors, you've seen a lot of outages in the not-for-profit space in software as a service. That vulnerability and the attack that's going on our systems now has been increased. So how are you protecting your system security-wise, but more importantly, how are you keeping your vendors to protect it at the same level that you do?
And Torpey, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I would just add that not only are your vendors going to be affected, but they rely on other vendors. So there's a waterfall effect to not only your reliance, but their reliance on their vendor environment and landscape. So not just relying on what your vendor tells you, but ask a little bit deeper questions to determine whether they have critical reliance on other vendors that could impact you as well.
Besides the monitoring, what are some best practices for security?
Yeah, so with the security, one of the best practices is making sure that they're tested all year long for that security. And that could be in the form of a SOC 2 report with the focus on security, but then also availability. That gives you independent comfort that the security has been tested throughout the period if that's a service organization that you rely on. Also, for your vendors, you may look at the there's a SOC for cyber risk management that could give you the tone and tenor of the SOC risk management effort at the company on a global basis. Other security reports include the PCI reports, depending on what the transaction is, etc. But the security, making sure that that vendor is doing not only the independent tests, but some of their own vulnerability and pen testing, and maybe write that in your service level agreement with them, that they prove to you that they're doing that on a regular basis and they're remediating any high risk items, because security is in constant change.
And Torpey, did you have anything to add?
I would echo exactly what Audrey had to say. And really, she hit on all the key points with regard to making sure you've got those security concerns built into your landscape of vendor management.
When we talk about vendor risk management best practices for supply chain, what are some of your suggestions that you would recommend?
I would start with your due diligence prior to signing any agreement. Most organizations do a really good job of this. Now you need to take it to the next level and do your monitoring. Monitoring what, as I mentioned earlier, what those performance measures are you build into the agreement. Does that vendor have adequate insurance, and not only liability insurance, but do they have cyber risk insurance? Do they have workers' comp insurance, depending on what they're performing for you? Do they have auto liability insurance if it's an organization that's doing deliveries for you? Don't look at just one aspect of insurance coverage. Are they a candidate for the new SOC for supply chain report? And Audrey alluded to this a little bit. It's another level of SOC reporting that can be secured for your vendors or from your vendors to determine how robust is their supply chain and do they have good controls built into their supply chain. And then monitoring the news and that respective industry you operate in. A lot of times a simple Google search can reveal enough information about a vendor to make you feel comfortable or cause you to lose some sleep at night and want to start to investigate. So basic blocking and tackling can go a long way towards helping you monitor what are the risks in your supply chain.
So as far as due diligence prior to engaging, what are some key items you should have in that, Audrey?
We do quite a bit of work with the IT due diligence, and what we do in that area is making sure that they have a history of keeping the environment secure. They have current hardware and software. They've kept their patching up to date. They have the tools and mechanisms to continue to monitor the security. And then when it comes to the availability, that they've actually been doing the availability checking, not only on their systems for utilization of the system, making sure there's capacity for growth, but of their vendors, making sure that they have enough backlog in their supply to feed that manufacturer, as an example. So the due diligence is critical in the due diligence sense when you're buying and selling a company, as well as when you're trying to start business with that company.
Thank you. So we promised everyone that we would give them 3 key action items that they could come away from this podcast. And you're actually going to get 6 because we have 3 from Torpey and 3 from Audrey. So Torpey, do you want to give your 3 key action items?
Sure. Number 1, ensure your vendor management accountability has been assigned. So the question Amy asked earlier about where does the responsibility for vendor risk management lie within an organization? You should be able to answer that question very easily and know who that individual is and where they sit and what they're doing. Number 2, communicate your vendor risk management responsibility and ownership to the organization. It shouldn't be a secret, and the whole organization should know where they could go if something good and or bad happens with a vendor and be able to capture that information. And then third is consider a vendor management tool. Many organizations have been tracking their vendors in an Excel spreadsheet or an Access database or some self-created means of tracking. And with software as a service companies creating tools specifically designed for vendor risk management, there's no reason to track this on a spreadsheet or back of a napkin or an Access database. There's some really good tools that incorporate a lot of the things we talked about in this podcast in one total package that is readily available for organizations to use.
Awesome. Thank you. What about you, Audrey?
Based on that accountability, responsibility, and the tools that Torpey laid out, I think the next 3 things are related to do it. So make sure you know, based on those dependencies, just do it. Just keep a focus on security. Keep asking those key vendors, are they checking their security, and have them show you. I am from the show me state. Keep a focus on the availability and viability of the companies. That could be changing very quickly in today's world. So making sure you're proactively either monitoring what could be out there in a news feed, as Torpey talked about, or other venues to make sure that their viability and availability is not being altered. And last thing, as part of that, just checking with those vendors regularly, regardless of, how well they onboarded. Leaving it sit for 2 to 3 years is probably not a good practice right now.
Awesome. Well, that is it for this episode. And I want to thank you both, Audrey and Torpey, for giving us all this great information and ways we can action it right away after this podcast. You can connect with both Audrey and Torpey and myself through our LinkedIn profiles, which we'll link to in the show notes. And that's where you'll also find further information and links about vendor risk management, including what we mentioned during our discussion. It's easy to view the show notes. Just tap on the info icon in the podcast app on your smartphone or tablet. And you can also open this episode in your computer's web browser, and you should find everything right there. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, on your music, or simply visit gobeyonddisruption.com. That's gobeyonddisruption.com. From Cincinnati, Ohio, I'm Amy Vetter. Until next time, keep listening and keep safe.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at aicpa-cima.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.